Hello, I'm Fran Lyon-Dugan. I'm with Strategic Consulting and Coaching, and I'm happy to be here with all of you today from NACCE to discuss business and professional ethics for nonprofit leaders. I hope you find this session helpful in your professional growth. The slides for the presentation are available here for download, so you'll have them for future review. And also this session is being recorded in case you'd like to listen to it later. A little bit about the organization I represent. I'm with Strategic Consulting and Coaching. We're a nonprofit capacity building firm, and we have expertise in executive and leadership transitions, professional consulting, board development, and coaching and training. And we work with nonprofit organizations like yours. The agenda for today. First, we're going to go through some definitions and a little history. We're going to talk about ethical culture in an organization, how it can be formed, what makes it up, and how it can be changed. We're going to talk about individual ethical behavior and how people develop their own moral values and decision-making capabilities. We're going to talk about something called giving voice to your values. And this is really about how to make sure that the ethical decisions that you make are really in line with your values and how to speak up for your own values when they're challenged. And finally, we'll have some questions and discussion if we have time for that, and then a summary of what we've done today. So first, let's look at some definitions here. Most people, and I'm probably no exception, use the terms morals and ethics almost interchangeably. And there's probably some disagreement on exact definitions, but I've found these definitions to be pretty helpful. I think of morals as an individual person's code of conduct or their personal compass, if you will. If you think of things that your parents have taught you or that you've learned in religious instruction or from your personal experiences. For instance, if your parents' mantra was always tell the truth, then you will probably have that as part of your personal moral code. Many people in the military tell me that they've adopted the moral codes from their particular branch of the service, and that is a strong moral compass for them. On the other hand, ethics are really the rules of conduct for a particular group or culture. For instance, my husband's a CPA, and the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants has a professional code of ethics. It really covers how they approach all aspects of their business from an ethical standpoint. From a religious tradition, those of the Islamic faith have a group of morals called the 5 pillars that outline key aspects of their ethical code in the categories of faith, prayer, chastity, fasting, and pilgrimage to Mecca. There's also a beautiful Native American code of ethics, which includes things like be tolerant of others who are lost on their path, do not take what is yours, and respect all things that are placed on this earth. Corporations have codes of ethics too. IBM's business code of conduct guidelines serve as its global code of conduct for all employees and specifies its standards of business ethics, basic values, and principles. In the case of IBM and really the AICPA, these would be examples of business and professional ethics where they're really applied to the business environment. So let's look at how all this came about. If we look way back, way back in the 300s and 400s BC, Plato and Aristotle really had a mentorship thing going. They consistently gathered students and adults in their communities to talk about virtues, ethics, and of course politics and many other things. They were really trying to form a civilized society, and they did a great deal of pondering about how people might get along and live in harmony together. They felt that the human well-being was the highest aim of a civilized society, and also uh, the highest level that a person could achieve in life. And they felt that virtues were really the skills that they needed and the qualities a person had to have to live a good life. They felt that virtues could be learned and practiced and actually improved over time, and that parents and teachers needed to help develop these virtues in their own children and for teachers and their students. They felt that developing these virtues and good habits would help people decide what to do when they ran into ethical dilemmas in their lives and in their work, not unlike we do today. The Roman civilization was really having a lot of great debate about right and wrong in order to develop a system of lawfulness in their society. They talked about things like individual rights versus community rights, and that was a contentious element of that discussion. And that still carries on today. For example, we talk about whether children should be required to be vaccinated. Again, individual rights versus communal rights. Much of the legal terminology also came from the Romans, terms like habeas corpus and in absentia, and those terms are still used today. There are three important principles of Roman law that have also survived. The first is an accused person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. The second one is the accused is allowed to face their accuser and offer a defense against the charge. And lastly, guilt had to be established clearer than daylight, or what we say beyond the shadow of a doubt, using solid evidence. So those Roman principles are still in effect today. There are many biblical references to ethics in the Judeo-Christian faith. The most well-known ones are, of course, the Ten Commandments and also the Golden Rule: do to others as you would want done to you. But with recent emphasis on diversity in the workplace and in society at large, we're starting to hear more about the Platinum Rule. And this is do to others as they would want done to them. In other words, we shouldn't assume and we shouldn't base how we treat others necessarily on how we want to be treated, as they may have very different ideas about that based on their gender, age, sexual preference, culture, etc. Interestingly, there are other metal rules. We call them metal rules, like golden and platinum. There also is the iron rule, the silver rule. So I'll leave you to investigate those on your own. If you just Google metal rules, you'll find them. Makes for very interesting reading. There are also comparable concepts to the golden rule in other religions, and I've illustrated these on the next slide. I'm not going to read them all, but it is interesting. I got this at a Lutheran ecumenical conference, and I thought it was quite interesting. So again, all these various faith traditions have these comparable statements in their religious texts that are similar to the Golden Rule. And this helps us see that really across various different cultures as well as religious traditions, we have some similarity in these ideas. So let's move on to some history of business ethics. There really isn't much prior to the 1960s that's very noteworthy. During the agricultural and industrial age, I'd really question whether there was much emphasis on ethics. In fact, even in this day and age, in the farming industry, it's probably the widest use of child labor. So there are things that happened in those days, but they just weren't talked about. But as with many movements in society, breakthroughs in communication probably enabled more people to widely understand what others' lives were like and to say, hey, that's happening to me too, and it's just not fair. So starting with the 60s, we saw the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was really a landmark piece of legislation. Before the 60s, consumers also were largely ignored, And if you purchased something that didn't work, whether it be an electric toaster or a car, it was sort of tough luck. Consumers started to demand rights related to product quality, and you started to see manuals coming with things with numbers people could call if something didn't work and what their replacement and warranty provisions were. We also started to think about workers' rights, and unions began to form, and there was awareness of what we were doing to the environment, and there was a little bit of movement there. My parents had an old Victorian home near the steel mill in my hometown, and my mother talks about how difficult it was to keep the soot clean from numerous porches and balconies on that house because there were very few regulations regarding environmental impact of various businesses with clean air and clean water. The 1970s, there was the emergence of, really the emergence of business ethics as an academic field. And we started to have some universities urging academics to try to apply philosophical ethical principles and concepts to business. But unfortunately, very few academics were practicing business people. So there was quite a divide between the two at the beginning. The other significant thing in the 70s was OSHA. It emerged as a government agency that was concerned with enforcing worker health and safety. In the 1980s, we had the Society of Business Ethics emerging, and we started to see ethical codes of conduct in large corporations. I worked for IBM at the time, and there was a lot of time spent on this in management school and in employee meetings. In the 1990s, the government developed some consistent sentencing guidelines for individuals and organizations convicted of felonies and serious misdemeanors in the United States federal court system. And this was noteworthy because prior to that, individual courts had quite divergent penalties. And again, people comparing them found them to be unfair across multiple court decisions. In the 1990s, we also started to see the position of corporate ethics officer in large corporations. And this was a person who would be responsible for communicating, training, and auditing a company for ethical behavior to avoid missteps and even criminal prosecution. In the 2000s, we've seen the implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley, bringing about greater accountability in management and board positions. Triple bottom line reporting by companies really emphasizes that they care more for more than just their stakeholders and their shareholders. They started to talk about the impact of their decisions on employees and their families, their communities, and the environment. Finally, the UN Global Compact for Corporations came up with 10 guiding principles in 4 areas that are listed here. Principles that member countries could agree upon across various cultures and countries. So that's a little history and context around ethics and how it's come to play in business. So why are professional ethics important in an organization today? What's at stake? Well, first of all, we have legal and financial repercussions. For certain ethical violations, your company could be fined and people could actually go to jail. Obviously, these are the more serious violations. We think about things like the SEC, entities like the SEC, and how they guide behavior. Strong ethical behavior can also help you attract and retain good clients, customers, and investors. Especially in the age of social media, missteps can really result in disaster for the reputation of your company. If we think about what happened with United Airlines after the man was dragged off the plane last year, or what about the recent incident at Starbucks where officers were called when 2 African American men didn't want to buy anything and were simply waiting for a colleague to join them. These incidents certainly had community and human impact as well as brand impact. So these are 4 important reasons why we need to pay attention to professional ethical behavior. But how do we know how employees are going to act and whether they're going to do the right thing and how to recover from bad behavior? These questions really lead us to our next topic, which is ethical culture. Ethical culture is really the glue that holds a group of people together in terms of how they behave on the job and from an ethical perspective. It's the values and the beliefs that they share. It's made up of both formal and informal systems. In many organizations, there's a code of conduct that people are introduced to when they're first hired, and they may have to sign off on them annually. It symbolizes that they've read and understood what the organization expects in terms of behavior. However, an ethical code can never be specific enough to address every decision that an employee may need to make. They learn a lot about the ethical culture through informal means. For example, when a project fails, does management yell and scream and punish those that they feel are at fault? Or do they gather the team together, debrief on what went wrong, and put measures in place for people to learn how to do better in the future? When an ethical lapse occurs, such as expense reports being padded, do they fire the individuals involved? Or do they take less extreme disciplinary measures and then hold trainings on how to properly fill out expense reports and reiterate what expenses are allowed? Even such things as whether the managers eat lunch with their subordinates or how frequently top executives visit areas where employees are working send signals to people that have an effect on how people behave. It really takes organizational commitment and executive leadership to focus and form the ethical culture. And people are especially observant of their immediate managers. When I was hired as CEO of the Girl Scouts in Wisconsin, they had a 7-page dress code. It even went so far as specifying what kinds of shirts or shoes should be worn. In a staff meeting about 3 months into the job, I said, "We're doing away with the dress code. You should wear what's appropriate for what you're doing on a particular day. For example, if you're going to be at camp working with girls, wear camp clothes. If you're going with me to Rotary meeting, wear a dark suit," which is what I wear. So it was my way of showing them that they were empowered and that I trusted them. Building trust in small ways really helps pave the way to building a strong ethical culture. There's a group of researchers that came up with a model of organizational trust. The source is listed at the bottom of this slide. It starts with a clear mission and values. Who are we? What do we do? What do we stand for? And what do we think is important? Patagonia, an organization known for its corporate social responsibility, says its mission is to build the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, use business to inspire, and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. So there's no doubt as to what their priorities are. Next, leadership and management must live out those company values on a daily basis. There must be strong ethical shared norms and values, and their processes must reinforce trust-inducing behaviors. Top executive Robert Scott of Morgan Stanley, after 9/11 in the World Trade Center, said that they immediately called that disaster a human tragedy, not a financial one. He said that this became a tagline for everything that they did. He said that having a message and a tone was very consistent and important to them as they got back on their feet. Employees pulled together and helped each other recover and care for each other, and they carried on their work when they were able. So this process that they developed and the values that they shared really encouraged and built the ethical culture. The organization's processes must also reinforce trust-inducing behaviors. Do you have a checker checking the checkers, or do you trust people to carry through on their responsibilities? Do you give people authority to make decisions and then hold them accountable? Zappos, the online shopping site, gives their customer service representatives enormous leeway to make decisions for their customers. There are stories on their websites about customer service representatives spending hours on the phone to make sure that their customers are happy. And they have a culture camp for new employees. They believe that creating a strong company culture can improve employee engagement, increase productivity, promote brand loyalty, and enhance performance and financial performance. Building trust is important, but the organization still needs to have clear governance in place that will ensure compliance with the law and with company policies. Periodic audits and separation of duties are the types of processes that will catch wrongdoing so that the organization can correct bad behavior. Near my hometown in Dixon, Illinois, there was a woman named Rita Cromwell, and she committed what is believed to be the largest municipal fraud in the U.S. history by stealing $53.7 million over 2 decades. There was obviously a huge lack of oversight in the roles and responsibilities that she had in that organization. So these are some elements of a strong ethical culture, but it still boils down to individual behavior on the part of your employees. So here's an interesting gap for you to consider. 97% of adults feel that they are trustworthy. Yet only 75% of adults feel the people around them are trustworthy. In other words, we all think that we behave better than others think we do. We are they. So let's look at some of the factors around individual moral development and behavior. A man named Lawrence Kohlberg did some research on cognitive moral development, and he came up with what he called various levels and stages of moral development, how people progress in their moral development over their growth and age. He had 3 levels, and each of these levels was made up of 2 stages. This starts at the bottom with level 1, stages 1 and 2. In stage 1, this is simple obedience to authority. Think about a child and their parent telling them no when they reach for a hot stove. They learn later that it's because it's hot and dangerous, but their early response is based on the fact that their parents said no. In the exchange stage, which is stage 2, a person behaves in a certain way because there's something in it for them. Let's think of the man who tells his work buddy, "Hey, I have 2 tickets for the Vikings game. If you help me get this project finished, we could go to the game together. What do you say?" The buddy's induced to help because he knows he'll get to go to the game. There's something in it for him. Level 2 also includes 2 stages, stages 3 and 4. In stage 3, a person is looking for conformity with social norms and approval. For example, a girl might shoplift because her friends tell her it's the thing that they're all doing, and it gives them a rush when they can beat the odds and not get caught. In a more positive example, a restaurant employee might help others clean up when their area isn't busy because they've developed a team atmosphere and are consistently praised as a group for helping each other out. Step 4 goes a step further in that an individual will do things that uphold laws or duties. People vote in elections because they feel it's their civic duty to do so. They pay taxes because the law requires it. You'll see the note that most Americans are at stage 3 or 4. Level 3 includes the highest stages of moral development, stages 5 and 6. Stage 5 is about doing things for societal good. Using the example of Patagonia again, Patagonia employees give testimonials that they work there because they feel their company backs them in doing good for the environment and for society at large. and that's rewarding to them. So you could think of them probably in stage 5. Someone might take part in a protest because they feel it will benefit society to get behind a cause that they believe in. They might serve on a board because they feel that that can help society. Stage 6 is what Colbert identified really as a theoretical stage, one that's rarely achieved. When I ask students who might be in this stage, they normally respond with names like Gandhi or Mother Teresa. So how might this information be helpful to us with ethical behavior in the workplace? Well, people in level 2, where we said most Americans are presumed to be looking up and looking around. So they're highly susceptible to external influences. What we can do is design formal systems that really encourage an ethical culture. We can design reward systems and role expectations that say this is what we expect of you, and this is what will be in it for you if you do this, if you behave in a certain way. Level 3 employees are more rare. They're more independent of external influence, and we can use these people as leaders, can find these people and single them out because they can encourage other people to behave more ethically by their example because they're at a higher stage. We really believe that moral development can be enhanced through training. We can have training that says, here's why we do things, and here's a higher level that you can hope to achieve through ethical behavior. There's another factor at work here called locus of control. Let's talk a little bit about this one. This is an individual's perception of how much control he or she exerts over events in life. And this will influence a person's perceptions of his or her own actions, and it can shift over time. At one end, we have people that feel that fate and luck and the power of others is over them, and they really have no effect on the outcomes of their lives. You'll hear people say things like, oh, it's just the luck of the draw, or it's just not fair. It doesn't matter what I do. The powers that be will decide. At the other end, we have people who have a strong internal locus of control. They feel that their efforts matter and that they're accountable for their choices and for the outcomes of their life. They're the ones who'll seek further education and training, and you'll hear them use I statements, saying things like, I'll just have to figure it out, or I sure bungled that one. Everyone falls somewhere on this continuum, and we may move on it depending on what realm of our life we're in. For example, at home, someone may feel a very strong locus of control, whereas at work they may not, and vice versa. So why should we concern ourselves with where we or others are in their moral development or their locus of control? Well, Philip Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford University, put it well when he said, virtually anyone could be recruited to engage in evil deeds that deprive other human beings of their dignity, humanity, and life. We live with the illusion of moral superiority. We can think about how the Native Americans were treated in the early days of our country and even today. We can look at the Holocaust, Rwanda, or what's happening with the Rohingya in Myanmar. There was an experiment that was done back in the 60s called the Milgram experiment. And this demonstrates this pretty clearly how humans have a potential for evil that's influenced by people in authority. So let's watch this video about this experiment. So 2/3 of the participants in that experiment were willing to hurt someone if they were told to do so by authority. So what kinds of behaviors are we talking about when we talk about ethical transgressions? Well, they really fall into three categories. The first is deception or lying, and all the related activities listed below that bubble there. Your manager comes into you as a project leader and says, "How's the project going?" Your answer of "good, really good" might satisfy him or her, but if you have delays in the project, areas that are over budget, or your team's not getting along, you're clearly being deceptive because you're not telling the whole truth, you're withholding information, you're sugarcoating the truth, and you're overusing tact. The second one is stealing. Stealing is the stealing of taking a property of others without permission. This also includes embezzlement, swindling, and it includes more than physical property. It includes intellectual property and ideas. So stealing can include everything from grabbing a few extra post-it notes to take home to showing a high-level patent invention to a competitor. We know a lot about stealing when we think about um, situations like Enron and Bernie Madoff and how people have taken something that wasn't theirs. The third area is harming, and this encompasses quite a lot when you examine all these different areas. It obviously includes direct acts of threats and violence, but it also includes indirect behaviors, such as those that lead to harm of another person. When your manager approaches you about a possible sexual harassment claim against your peer, who's a friend of yours, you could say, "I don't really think he would do that," or "I've never seen him do that," when in fact you've seen him misbehave in social situations before. This could lead to harm of the victim or cause people to not believe her claims. So it could lead to the physical harming of another person. So at this point, you're probably thinking, as most of you do, as most of us do, that I don't participate in these behaviors. It could be, though, that you're very good at rationalizing. Reasoning is the process of analyzing a situation and forming judgments as to what to do. You're clear and you're objective. Rationalizing, on the other hand, is constructing a justification for something we want to do, even though we know that that behavior is flawed. We do this in order to make ourselves feel better or to exhibit to others that what we're doing is okay. This could include not taking responsibility at all and saying, "It's not really my problem. I'm just going to stay out of it." So again, we use our excuses or justifications to, to self-satisfy, to avoid embarrassment. People are often aware that they're rationalizing. It's become such a normal behavior. Let's look at an example of reasoning versus rationalization. Let's say a group of influential people from your work frequently go out for happy hour, and it's known around the office that they usually drink too much. Things have happened in the past at these happy hours that have caused harm to people in terms of gossip, harassment, or rude behavior. On one occasion, they ask you to join them. A reasoning of this situation would tell you that excessive drinking can lead to multiple bad outcomes, and you would decide to turn them down. When asked for a reason, you would say that you don't feel it's the best way for you to spend time with your peers. If you really wanted to go to be accepted by this influential group, remember stage 3 of Kohlberg's theory, social influence, you might rationalize, telling yourself that you should go because it would help you to get ahead. You could network with the right people, and that's really important. And you've always been able to hold your liquor. So you can see there the difference between reasoning and rationalization. There are some triggers that you can look for in rationalization. Things that you might hear often when people are rationalizing are phrases like, If you can't beat them, join them. If I don't do it, somebody else will. Comes with the territory. And the most famous one, everyone else is doing it. So how can we look at an ethical dilemma and try to decide what to do? What's the right thing to do? What kind of a framework or process can we use for analyzing it? Well, there are a number of moral frameworks that can help us with this. The source for this slide is listed at the bottom. And this group of researchers came up with 4 frameworks that help us break down the decision-making process. What the first one is actually doing is looking at decisions based on the focus of the action. What is the person actually doing compared to the principles and standard of conduct that a rational person might use? The second one looks at the person doing the decision making, the agent, and their character. The third is focused on the outcome of the situation. What will happen if I decide this way or that way? And the fourth one is based on relationships and the care that we have for others. How will this decision impact the relationships I have or that others involved have with each other? So we're going to look at these 4 frameworks in a little bit more detail. The decision focused on the action is sometimes called deontological, based on the Greek word dion, meaning obligation or duty. A person deciding something based on this framework would reason that their decision is right because it's based on a rule or a principle. An example might be that killing someone is wrong. This is a widely shared and observed concept. However, if someone were trying to use a self-defense claim for killing another person, a person using this theory might not support that because they would say that killing someone is wrong, even if it is done in self-defense. So the weakness of this framework is that it can be legalistic and not take into consideration extenuating circumstances, simply based on rules. The second framework that's focused on the agent is sometimes called virtue ethics. It says, what would a good person do, or a person in this role do? It's focused on how others will see us and how our reputation might be upheld or changed based on something we decide. We often hear people talk about their personal brand. What we do reflects on our personal brand. An example might be a whistleblower who exposes someone at a company doing an illegal activity because they're practicing the virtues of truthfulness, courage, honesty. They feel that they should come forward because it's what good people do. A weakness of this theory is that it really puts too much emphasis on ourselves and our reputation versus what we need to do or how we can serve others. For example, after a merger, a new CEO may feel compelled to do drastic employee cuts because that's what his reputation is as a turnaround guy, when in fact there might be other ways to cut expenses and costs. The next framework focuses on the outcomes of the decision, and there are really 2 theories at work here. One is called utilitarianism, and we often hear the phrase greatest good for the greatest number of people. Stakeholder theory focuses on the effect our behaviors have on a range of stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, investors, suppliers, vendors, the community, the environment. So someone using this framework will examine carefully how their decision might affect each stakeholder and determine whether the decision is helpful to the most people and harmful to the least. In this case, the ends justify the means. An example of this framework is the benefits design process in most companies. Usually a benefits design takes into account what health, disability, insurance, retirement plans, etc., are the most beneficial to the most employees while being affordable to the employer. A weakness of this framework is that it can lead to short-term choices that can't be sustained over time. We can't always accurately predict the outcome of our behaviors. So basing a decision on that is sometimes hard or impossible. For example, a factory closure. It's hard to examine what might be the full outcome of that decision. The last framework that we are going to look at is focused on relationships and care of those relationships. It considers that ethics is not a science, but involves emotions and relationships among people. And it focuses on the ability to sustain those healthy relationships as part of moral life. It considers the fact that ethics is not just abstract, but includes emotionally charged feeling and sentiment between people. Oh, and I forgot to mention that care theory was developed by Carol Gilligan, who had some issues with the Kohlberg stages of development and felt that they didn't really consider relationships among people. There are some cultural influences in this one. One called Gangxi in Chinese heavily considers the element of their social networks, their mutual obligations, and goodwill towards each other. So in this case, you'll see friends hiring family members, extended family, and good friends. And this is not considered unusual, nor does it need to be explained. Dharma in the Indian culture is similar and stresses the importance of relationships and the duties people owe to others within their own social network. An example of this framework is actually one that I had at IBM when an employee's grandmother passed away. The bereavement at IBM was restricted to mother, father, sister, brother, husband, and wife. So it didn't qualify. She didn't qualify to be able to go to the funeral of her grandmother. She didn't have any vacation time, and her grandmother lived in another state. What wasn't taken into consideration was that her parents had died when she was young, and her grandmother had raised her. I considered this relationship and the circumstances, and I let her use some comp time to attend the funeral because I wanted to consider the relationship that she had with her grandmother and how important that was to her, and in me making that decision to let her go to the funeral. So we have these frameworks that help us examine our decision making and use a framework that has some research behind it. But sometimes we know what we want to do or we need to do, but it's hard to move forward because of the pressures we might feel in the workplace. Mary Gentile was a researcher who dealt with this phenomena, and she created this idea called giving voice to values. What it is you know what you believe is the right course of action, but you feel disempowered, unsure, or unable to find a way to confront conflicting pressures in the workplace. She wrote a book, there's a picture of it here on this slide, and it's one that you can purchase on Amazon. So let's look at this, at what Mary developed. Once you know what you need to do, she looked at how do you go about getting it done effectively? What would you need to say, to whom, in what sequence, and how could you anticipate what the conflicts or pressures might be coming back at you? Is there some data you might need to stand behind your choice? And how could you approach people? Would you approach people one-on-one, or would you approach people as a group and try to win support for your decision? She talks about rehearsing and pre-scripting what you need to say and practicing it with a peer. It's all about making it easier to act upon your own personal value. Well, let's look at an example. Let's say you're in the teacher's lounge at school where you work as a liaison. The room is crowded as it's lunchtime. One of the staff tells a racist joke, and most people laugh. You believe that racist jokes are wrong. So you need to think through this and think, if you don't feel empowered, how could you feel more empowered and prepared next time? Who would you approach and what would you say? What data would you need? How could you approach people one-on-one or building support within a group? What could you suggest as approaches for building support for this kind of behavior in the future? In other words, how could you affect or change the culture? Who could you work with and pre-script with to practice what you might say so that you could build confidence and courage to speak up next time? What other ideas could you act on to make it easier? And how could you anticipate some of the rationalizations that people might have? You might hear things like, it was just a joke, or we all have to lighten up at lunchtime or we'd go crazy, or geez, can you just get over it? So how would you pre-script something where you could come back? You could come back to people and you could argue for your point of view and perhaps change that ethical culture. I'd like to hear some of the other ethical dilemmas that you've encountered and how you might deal with those using some of these frameworks. What we've done is to go over some definitions and history. We've talked a little bit about ethical culture. We've looked at individual ethical behavior and how those behaviors are developed over time. We've talked about how ethical frameworks can help us make decisions, good decisions, and how we can avoid rationalizing. And finally, we've talked about giving voice to your values and Mary Gentile's process of how to build a rational argument and possibly change the ethical culture. I hope that you've appreciated some of the information that we have here today. The slides are loaded so that you can download them and print them out or review them again. My information is here, my phone number. If you please feel free to call me if you have any questions. And I've enjoyed being here with you today. Thank you very much.